Confiscation of gold, a return to the gold standard, central bank digital currencies, and the future price of gold. All popular topics right now. So I figure if I make a video of all four things, it's either going to be the most popular video of all time, or I'm going to get yelled at in the comments. Okay, so we're going to talk about the future of gold. And this is a really broad topic, and it ranges from everything from the gold standard and gold confiscation to cryptocurrencies, central bank, digital currencies, CBDCs, and then just the general long-term preservation of value in precious metals. So it gets into some of the topics that I don't always like to discuss. We'll see where this goes, but I'm not going to get into politics. This is about gold's long-term value, and any conversation about gold as a currency or its role in a fixed rate of exchange, that is simply related to the price of gold and where it could go. So I'll start with Peter Schiff, and I imagine this is the only time that I will say that. But if you allow the man an uninterrupted 6 or 7 minutes, he will take you through a very logical and linear path of debt and government spending that leads to more debt with really no way of digging out of that cycle without creating further debt. My understanding of his view is that the only way out of that debt cycle is through rapid inflation that then leads to the whole system needing to be reset. And he uses the reset word, but not in the way that the Great Reset is thrown around. I think that's an important distinction. But the way that he tells it plays kind of like a double catch-22. The Fed can't reduce the debt by raising interest rates because that would make the debt harder to repay. So inflation then runs wild as a result, and that inflation requires additional government spending, which, of course, sends us further into debt. Now, the reset that Peter Schiff is talking about is a return to the gold standard, only this time the national and global debt is so high that the price of gold will need to be set at something like $20,000. Mr. Schiff lays this all out in small, feasible steps. So you don't feel like he's telling you anything that isn't either already happening or very likely, but he's using the conditions of 2020 as if they were a natural progression of what was already happening. And he tells you he predicted it all. So when he says the only logical step is the other thing he's been saying all along, well, it feels a little bit more believable. And that is because he's using a very basic sales tactic of getting a person to agree with you in steps. You do that over and over, and then eventually you sell them on your big idea or your big product. Now, if Peter Schiff just came straight out and said, hey, the price of gold is going to be $20,000 because we are going back to the gold standard without taking you through that journey, well, very few people would remember his name. Now, my point here isn't to dismantle anything Peter Schiff is saying. It's not to debate a return to the gold standard. It's just to give a basis to that idea of gold being repriced at 10 times the current value, because you'll hear it. And without that background of why it might go there, really it doesn't make any sense. Because I brought it up though, I'll just say that personally, I don't think a return to a gold standard is really even possible, since any country that adopted it would be at an immediate disadvantage to any country that didn't. And then all debts would have to be either repaid or renegotiated. So really the likelihood there is just very minute. And I'm not trying to convince anyone either way. If you believe in the gold standard, that's fine. That's not going to affect the rest of what I say here. I just personally don't give it any real thought. Now, even less likely to me is gold confiscation, and I know that it's a popular topic on YouTube, but the main reason that I say that it's less likely is because first you would need that return to the gold standard for it to make any sense. Now, in 1933, when the U.S. government nationalized gold ownership, it wasn't truly confiscation. It wasn't seized. It was nationalized. That means that people were paid at a set rate. Now, the insult to injury, of course, came there after the price of gold being increased dramatically just after private ownership was made illegal. And to me, the idea of gold confiscation and a return to the gold standard are kind of paired for that reason. It's a little bit of a case of being careful what you wish for. So like I said, I don't find either one likely, but there are ideas there that are pretty popular and somewhat feasible. The idea that if you fix the supply of money, you hypothetically get rid of inflation, for instance. That idea comes from a fixed rate of exchange if you fix it around something like gold. And you can more or less prove that point by looking at what happened to Great Britain and the United States during their reliance on the gold standard. You would see that inflation was effectively zero. Really, the only way to increase your money supply there, if gold is your money, is through mining or some kind of discovery, peaceful or otherwise. And I'm going to try to stay out of the rabbit hole of inflation, but I'll just say one thing. That economists would probably tell you that inflation actually favors the less wealthy in society. So anyone who's borrowing money is going to see the value of that debt get eaten away by inflation, where in a deflationary time, that's going to favor people with more money, since saved money will actually increase in value. So Peter Schiff's idea of the reset would actually favor the wealthy, particularly if the wealthy were saving in gold. So we know why someone like Peter Schiff would want a gold standard, but knowing that reset would also mean that national debts would need to be repaid or renegotiated, a lot of countries are just stuck. They don't have a clear path out. And it's just far more likely that any corrective measure to future runaway inflation would be a new solution rather than something that worked to varying degrees 100 years ago. And I guess that's where we get into central bank digital currencies, or CBDCs. Now, a nationalized digital currency would add a few benefits. Some of those benefits that you see in cryptocurrency, like speeding up payments, removing transaction fees, and then working towards some kind of international standard. Now, if you've heard people talk about the one world currency and it freaks you out, well, just hold that thought for a minute. We'll come back to that. That idea of an international standard for global trade, well, that's one of the reasons the United States followed others to implement the gold standard in the first place. We needed a way to allow currency conversion for global trade. That way, each country couldn't just set their own currency value to whatever they want, because they had to be able to convert that currency back to gold. Now, the downside of CBDCs, of course, are loss of privacy, since central banks would administer the entire system. But any implementation of a CBDC won't result in commercial banks just simply going away. And I guess what that means is that you could transfer funds from a CBDC to a checking account or to a debit card, and then you could make your purchase with that. So you could make a purchase using a credit card even, and then just make a payment toward that card from the CBDC account. And basically what I'm saying there is, if you don't live in an authoritarian country, then those commercial banks aren't going away, and nothing's going to change as far as the sensitivity, the privacy of the purchase you're making, because you can continue to use those other accounts. I feel like I need to take a deep breath here. Let's just say that the privacy concern for central bank digital currencies is largely exaggerated unless you feel like that is going to be the only option of payment for you. That's another one of those parts that I just don't want to debate. You can kind of look at either side of that, decide for yourself. The interesting part to me is that if the use of central bank digital currencies becomes more popular or even required by some governments, well, then they only work internationally if they use a fixed rate or they're set to a fixed rate. And if any of those central banks wanted to fix the rate of that digital currency to something other than the US dollar, so say China or Russia, well, the idea the US dollar as the world's reserve currency starts to erode a little bit. That's another aside. So to focus again, I'll just say that if you feel the cryptocurrency space feels like it's a little bit of the Wild West right now, well, it hasn't even gotten into the complicated stuff yet. And that international trade is when we get there. If somebody else's CBDC is not set against the US dollar, for instance, as the world reserve currency, well, then when you go to convert that payment, what do you convert it to? So at some point, you're converting digital currencies to other digital currencies, and probably from there, other digital currencies. And eventually, the line between physical assets and currencies goes from being blurry to being non-existent. And I don't think that that means that the value of physical assets goes down. I think that it actually goes up in that case. And the biggest thing here that we have yet to experience is a major security breach with one of these digital assets. And it's just not realistic to think that that will never happen. So to bring this all back to the long-term price of gold, I just don't see a return to the gold standard, especially not one that allows convertibility into gold. I don't see a future where we're buying groceries with silver coins or houses with gold, at least not directly. And I can't imagine a return to the gold standard that wouldn't jeopardize private gold ownership in some way. But I also don't see a future that operates solely on digital currencies that are floating on individual relative scarcity like Bitcoin is, or based on countries setting individual currency values. And I've seen a few YouTubers talk about that very thing, where introducing a CBDC, so like in the United States, introducing a digital dollar, where that would give the Fed even more power to set that exchange rate and allow inflation to continue to run wild. For the sake of argument, though, the part that I think gets confused is that inflation, if inflation did run away because of a CBDC, that inflation would actually benefit the poor, not the other way around. And a single one world currency, well, that's pretty far out there, because that would require all countries to participate. It would require that they all give up their inflation lever. It would require that they repay or renegotiate all debts. And it would probably require that they criminalize all other options. And just generally, they would all have to agree and cooperate. And that just isn't something that's happening anytime soon. And of course, this is all my opinion, but what I do see is a continued strong performance for gold. I see the continued use of inflation as a way for governments to chip away at debt, and I see a continued need for hard assets with high liquidity, maybe even more so with greater adoption of digital currencies. And both of those two things point to higher long-term prices for gold. But what do I know? I'm just some guy with a YouTube channel. So what do you think? Let us know in the comments where you see things going, and while you're there, hit that like button if you're into it. And if you're interested in the topic of gold and silver in general, just make sure you're subscribed, and hey, tell a friend. And if you made it this far, well, thank you again for watching. I always appreciate your time. Take care.